The desert wind carried the smell of death and gunpowder across the barren landscape. In the distance, smoke rose from what was once a thriving military outpost, now reduced to rubble and scattered equipment. Somewhere in that chaos, 540 Marines were fighting for their lives, cut off from all support, their radios dead, their hope fading with each passing hour. 2 kilometers away, on a rocky ridge that most would consider impossible to reach, a figure in desert camouflage adjusted the scope of a custom-built rifle. The hands were steady, despite having climbed for 6 hours through treacherous terrain. The breath was controlled, measured, patient. Through the crosshairs, the scene below looked like hell on earth. This is the story of how one person's incredible skill and unwavering determination turned what should have been a massacre into one of the most remarkable rescue operations in modern military history. It's a story about courage when all seems lost, about precision when chaos reigns, and about how sometimes the most unlikely hero emerges from the most desperate situations. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for decades to come. But it all started 3 days earlier, when everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and amber as Sergeant Elena Rodriguez checked her gear one final time. The forward operating base bustled with activity as soldiers prepared for what intelligence reports called a routine patrol mission. Rodriguez, one of the few female snipers in the Marine Corps, had earned her reputation through countless successful missions in the unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan. Her commanding officer, Colonel James Mitchell, gathered the unit leaders around a makeshift table covered with satellite photos and topographical maps. The mission brief seemed straightforward enough. Intelligence had identified a suspected weapons cache in a remote valley approximately 40 kilometers northeast of their current position. The plan was to deploy 540 Marines in a combined operation to secure the area, investigate the cache, and establish a temporary forward position. Rodriguez studied the terrain carefully through the photos. Something about the landscape troubled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. The valley was surrounded by high ridges on 3 sides, with only one apparent exit route. It was the kind of natural formation that military tacticians both loved and feared. It could provide excellent defensive positions, but it could also become a deadly trap if things went wrong. As the convoy of armored vehicles and transport trucks rolled out of the base just after dawn, Rodriguez found herself positioned in the lead reconnaissance vehicle. Her spotter, Corporal Marcus Chun, sat beside her, equally focused on the mission ahead. Chun had worked with Rodriguez for 8 months, and they had developed the kind of wordless communication that kept snipers alive in hostile territory. The journey to the target area took nearly 3 hours over rough mountain roads. The convoy moved in standard formation, with scout vehicles ahead and heavy armor providing protection for the main body of troops. Rodriguez kept her eyes on the surrounding terrain, noting potential sniper positions and escape routes. Her training had taught her to always think like both hunter and hunted. When they reached the valley entrance, the convoy paused while advance teams swept the area for improvised explosive devices. The landscape was eerily quiet, with only the sound of wind whistling through the rocky outcroppings. Local intelligence had suggested this area was largely abandoned, but Rodriguez had learned never to trust such reports completely. The weapons cache was supposed to be located in an abandoned village about 2 kilometers into the valley. Satellite imagery showed a cluster of mud brick buildings that appeared to have been deserted for months. The plan called for the Marines to establish a perimeter around the village while specialized teams searched for the hidden weapons. As the convoy entered the valley proper, Rodriguez noticed that the feeling of unease she had experienced earlier was growing stronger. The terrain was even more restrictive than the photos had suggested. The valley walls rose steeply on both sides, and the single road wound through the bottom like a snake. If enemy forces controlled the high ground, the Marines would be sitting ducks. Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio, confirming that advanced scouts had reached the village without incident. The buildings appeared to be empty, just as intelligence had predicted. Rodriguez allowed herself to relax slightly as her vehicle rounded a bend in the road. Perhaps her instincts were wrong this time. Perhaps this really would be a routine mission. That illusion shattered when the first explosion echoed off the valley walls. The lead vehicle in the convoy simply disappeared in a ball of flame and smoke. The improvised explosive device had been perfectly positioned to take out the scout team while simultaneously blocking the narrow road ahead. Before anyone could react, a second explosion rocked the rear of the convoy. In seconds, the Marines found themselves trapped in a deadly ambush. Rodriguez's vehicle screeched to a halt as gunfire erupted from positions along both sides of the valley. The enemy had clearly spent considerable time preparing this trap. Machine gun nests had been carefully positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked down from the heights, turning armored vehicles into burning hulks. The radio channels erupted in chaos as unit commanders tried to coordinate a response. Colonel Mitchell's voice cut through the confusion, ordering all units to take defensive positions and return fire. But defensive positions were hard to come by in the bottom of the valley. Most of the Marines found themselves pinned down behind disabled vehicles or scattered boulders. Rodriguez grabbed her rifle and followed Chun as they scrambled away from their burning vehicle. A mortar round exploded 20 meters to their left, showering them with rocks and debris. She could see Marines falling around her as sniper fire picked off anyone who showed themselves for more than a few seconds. Through her scope, Rodriguez tried to identify the enemy positions. The attackers had chosen their spots well. They were firing from concealed positions among the rocks, making return fire difficult and dangerous. The Marines were outnumbered and outgunned, caught in what military strategists call a kill zone. Chin pointed toward a small depression behind a cluster of boulders. It would provide some cover while Rodriguez tried to assess the situation. As they crawled toward the position, she could hear Colonel Mitchell on the radio attempting to coordinate with headquarters. The news was not good. The convoy was completely cut off, with no possibility of immediate reinforcement. From her new position, Rodriguez could see the full scope of the disaster. Nearly a dozen vehicles were burning, and casualties were mounting by the minute. The enemy fire was too intense and too well coordinated to be the work of a small insurgent group. This was a major operation, possibly involving hundreds of fighters who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The temperature in the valley was rising as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Marines who weren't wounded were already showing signs of heat stress as they tried to maintain defensive positions under the blazing sun. Water supplies were limited, and medical supplies were running low as corpsmen worked frantically to treat the wounded. Rodriguez realized that conventional tactics weren't going to save them. The Marines needed a game-changer, something the enemy wouldn't expect. She studied the terrain around the valley through her scope, looking for possibilities. The enemy positions were strong, but they weren't impregnable. A skilled sniper, operating from an unexpected position, might be able to turn the tide. The problem was getting to such a position. The valley walls were steep and rocky, offering little cover for anyone trying to climb them. And even if someone could reach the high ground, they would be isolated and vulnerable, cut off from support and supplies. As another mortar barrage shook the valley floor, Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. She turned to Chun and outlined a plan so dangerous that it bordered on suicidal. She would attempt to scale the northern wall of the valley, gain the high ground, and engage the enemy from an unexpected angle. It would mean leaving the relative safety of the defensive position and undertaking a solo mission with almost no chance of support or rescue. Chun tried to talk her out of it, pointing out the obvious risks and the low probability of success. But Rodriguez had already made up her mind. The Marines in the valley were going to die unless someone did something dramatic. She was the best sniper in the unit, and this was exactly the kind of impossible mission she had trained for her entire career. Colonel Mitchell's voice came over the radio again, more urgent this time. Headquarters had confirmed that no reinforcements would be available for at least 12 hours. The Marines would have to hold their positions and wait for relief. But Rodriguez knew that 12 hours might as well be 12 days. The enemy would overrun their positions long before help arrived. As she prepared to leave the defensive perimeter, Rodriguez took inventory of her equipment. She had her primary rifle, a modified M40 sniper system, along with approximately 200 rounds of ammunition. Her secondary weapon was a standard-issue sidearm with 3 spare magazines. She carried basic survival gear, including water for perhaps 6 hours in the desert heat. The climb would be the most difficult part of the mission. The northern wall of the valley was nearly vertical in places, with loose rock that could give way without warning. Rodriguez would have to move slowly and carefully, using every available hand and foothold. One mistake would send her tumbling back to the valley floor. As she began her ascent, Rodriguez could hear the battle continuing below. The sound of gunfire echoed off the rock walls, punctuated by explosions and the shouts of wounded men. Every minute that passed meant more casualties, more Marines who would never see home again. The The weight of responsibility pressed down on her as heavily as the gear on her back. The first 100 meters of the climb were the most treacherous. The rock face was loose and crumbling, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Rodriguez had to test each handhold carefully, knowing that a falling stone could give away her position to enemy spotters. She moved in the shadow of an overhanging ledge, hoping to remain invisible from the valley floor. Halfway up the wall, Rodriguez paused to rest and reassess her situation. Looking down, she could see the full scope of the ambush laid out below her. The enemy positions were even more extensive than she had initially realized. Machine gun nests, mortar positions, and sniper hides were scattered throughout the rocks on both sides of the valley. The Marines were completely surrounded, with no realistic hope of fighting their way out. The climb became even more difficult as Rodriguez neared the top of the ridge. The rock face was nearly vertical, and her equipment was becoming heavier with each passing minute. Her hands were bleeding from the sharp edges of the stones, and her water supply was running dangerously low. But she pushed on, driven by the knowledge that 540 of her fellow Marines were depending on her success. When she finally hauled herself over the edge of the ridge, Rodriguez collapsed for a moment to catch her breath. The climb had taken nearly 4 hours, and the sun was approaching its peak intensity. She was now approximately 2 kilometers from the main battle, positioned on high ground that offered commanding views of the entire valley. Through her scope, Rodriguez could see that the situation below had deteriorated even further. Several more vehicles were burning, and the Marine defensive perimeter had contracted significantly. The enemy appeared to be preparing for a final assault, moving fighters into position for what would likely be an overwhelming attack. Rodriguez quickly surveyed possible shooting positions along the ridge. She needed a location that offered clear lines of sight to key enemy positions while providing adequate concealment for her own safety. After several minutes of careful observation, she identified a cluster of large boulders near the edge of the cliff that would serve her purposes. Setting up her shooting position required meticulous attention to detail. Rodriguez arranged her equipment to provide maximum stability for long-range shots while ensuring she could move quickly if her position was compromised. She calculated wind speed and direction, adjusted her scope for the extreme range, and began the process of identifying priority targets. The first shot would be the most important. It needed to be perfect, both to maximize its tactical impact and to avoid revealing her position prematurely. Rodriguez studied the enemy positions through her scope, looking for the target that would cause the most disruption to their coordinated attack. She found it in a mortar position approximately 1,800 meters away. The crew was preparing to launch what appeared to be a major barrage against the Marine perimeter. Eliminating this target would not only save lives immediately, but would also signal to both sides that the tactical situation had suddenly changed. Rodriguez controlled her breathing, steadied her aim, and prepared to fire the shot that would begin one of the most remarkable sniper engagements in modern military history. Below in the valley, 540 Marines continued their desperate fight for survival, unaware that their salvation was taking aim from the impossible distance of 2 kilometers away. The silence before the shot seemed to stretch forever. Rodriguez lay perfectly still behind her rifle, her body molded to the rocky ground like she had grown from the mountain itself. Through her scope, she could see the mortar crew working with practiced efficiency, unaware that death was watching them from 2 kilometers away. The mathematics of the shot were staggering. At this distance, she would need to account for bullet drop, wind drift, temperature variations, and even the rotation of the Earth itself. Her training at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School had prepared her for extreme-range engagements, but nothing quite like this. Most sniper kills happened at distances under 800 meters. At 2 kilometers, she was pushing the absolute limits of both her equipment and her skills. The slightest miscalculation would send her bullet harmlessly into the rocks, accomplishing nothing except revealing her position to the enemy. Rodriguez had grown up hunting in the mountains of Colorado, where her father had taught her to read wind patterns and estimate distances by instinct. Those childhood lessons were serving her well now as she analyzed the environmental factors that would affect her shot. The wind was variable, shifting direction every few minutes as it swirled through the complex terrain of the valley. She waited for a lull in the breeze, watching dust and debris patterns far below to gauge wind conditions along the bullet's trajectory. The air was thinner at this altitude, which would affect the ballistics in ways she could only estimate. Her rifle had been perfectly zeroed at sea level, but here in the Afghan mountains, everything was different. The mortar crew below consisted of 3 fighters. One was preparing the next round while the other 2 adjusted the weapon's aim. Rodriguez could see that they were targeting the largest concentration of Marines, where Colonel Mitchell had established his command post behind a disabled armored personnel carrier. If that mortar barrage found its mark, it would decapitate the Marine leadership and probably end any organized resistance. Through her scope's magnification, Rodriguez could make out individual details of her target. The man operating the mortar was young, probably no more than 25, with dark hair and a carefully maintained beard. He wore a mixture of military surplus gear and traditional local clothing. For a moment, she saw him as a person rather than a target, someone who probably had a family waiting for him somewhere. But that moment of humanity passed quickly as another explosion rocked the valley floor, and she heard the screams of wounded Marines over her radio. This was war, and hesitation would only lead to more deaths among her own people. Rodriguez forced herself to focus on the technical aspects of the shot, treating it as a complex mathematical problem rather than an act of violence. Her breathing settled into the rhythm she had practiced thousands of times during training. In, out, natural pause. In, out, natural pause. During the natural pause, when her lungs were empty and her body was perfectly still, she would take the shot. But first, she needed to make final adjustments to her aim point. At 2 kilometers, she would need to aim several meters above her intended target to compensate for bullet drop. The M40 rifle was firing match-grade ammunition, but even the most precisely manufactured bullet would follow a parabolic arc over such an extreme distance. Rodriguez calculated the holdover in her head, then adjusted her point of aim accordingly. The wind was still variable, but she had identified a pattern in its behavior. Every few minutes, there would be a brief calm as the air currents shifted. During these windows, the wind effect would be minimal. She would have perhaps 10 seconds to take her shot before the next gust arrived. Rodriguez could hear the battle continuing below through her radio earpiece. Marine units were reporting increasing pressure from all sides as the enemy prepared for what appeared to be a coordinated assault. Time was running out. If she was going to act, it had to be now. She settled her crosshairs on a point approximately 3 meters above and 2 meters to the right of her target, compensating for both bullet drop and the prevailing wind direction. Her finger found the trigger and applied just enough pressure to take up the slack. Everything else faded away except the sight picture in her scope and the rhythm of her breathing. The moment came as the wind died to almost nothing. Rodriguez felt her body reach the perfect stillness of the natural pause. Her fingers squeezed the trigger straight back, applying steady pressure until the rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding peaks. The bullet's flight time over 2 kilometers was nearly 3 seconds, an eternity in combat conditions. Rodriguez maintained her sight picture, watching through the scope as her target continued working, oblivious to the death approaching him at over twice the speed of sound. For a moment, she wondered if she had missed entirely. At this distance, even a perfect shot could be thrown off by factors beyond her control. Then, the bullet found its mark. The mortar operator simply collapsed, dropping the shell he had been preparing to load. The other 2 fighters looked around in confusion, unable to understand what had happened. There had been no sound of gunfire from nearby, no obvious source for the sudden attack. Their teammate was simply there one moment, and gone the next. Rodriguez quickly worked the bolt of her rifle, chambering a fresh round. The confusion among the mortar crew wouldn't last long. Soon they would realize they were under sniper attack, and would either seek cover or try to spot her position. She needed to capitalize on their momentary disorientation. Her second target was one of the remaining mortar crew members, a tall man who was frantically looking around for signs of the sniper. Rodriguez adjusted her aim and fired again. This shot was slightly easier because she now had a confirmed range and had proven her wind calculations. The second fighter dropped beside the first. The third member of the mortar crew finally grasped what was happening. He abandoned the weapon and sprinted toward a cluster of rocks that would provide cover from long-range fire. Rodriguez tracked him through her scope, but held her fire. At a full run, moving erratically across uneven ground, he was too difficult to target even for her exceptional skills. More importantly, Rodriguez had achieved her primary objective. The mortar position was neutralized, which meant the planned barrage against the Marine command post would not happen. She had bought her fellow Marines some time, but the tactical situation was still desperate. Through her scope, Rodriguez began identifying other high-priority targets. A machine gun position approximately 1,600 meters away was pouring heavy fire into the Marine defensive perimeter. The crew was well positioned behind a natural rock wall, but Rodriguez could see a small gap in their cover that might allow for a shot. She adjusted her scope and calculated the new range and wind conditions. This shot would be slightly easier than the first two because the distance was shorter and she was gaining confidence in her equipment's performance at extreme range. Rodriguez settled into her shooting position and waited for the right moment. The machine gun crew was focused entirely on the Marines below, unaware that they were being stalked from the high ground. Rodriguez could see the muzzle flashes from their weapon as they fired burst after burst into the valley. Each burst represented potential casualties among her fellow Marines. When the wind conditions were right, Rodriguez took her third shot. The bullet struck the machine gunner in the upper torso, and the heavy weapon fell silent immediately. The assistant gunner tried to take over, but Rodriguez was already chambering another round. Her fourth shot eliminated the second target before he could resume firing. By now, word was spreading among the enemy fighters that they were under attack from a long-range sniper. Rodriguez could see men pointing toward the ridgeline where she was positioned, though they were still unsure of her exact location. Some began changing positions to seek better cover from high-angle fire. This reaction was exactly what Rodriguez had hoped for. Even if she couldn't eliminate every enemy fighter, she could disrupt their coordination and force them to focus on protecting themselves rather than attacking the Marines. Every minute of confusion and disruption bought time for her trapped comrades. But Rodriguez also knew that her position was becoming increasingly dangerous. The enemy would eventually organize a response to the sniper threat. They might send fighters to scale the ridge and hunt her down, or they might call in mortar fire on her suspected location. She needed to make the most of whatever time she had left. Her fifth target was another machine gun position, this one located on the opposite wall of the valley. The shot angle was more difficult because she was firing across the width of the valley rather than straight down its length. Wind conditions would affect the bullet differently, and the range was nearly 2 kilometers once again. Rodriguez studied the target through her scope, noting the positions of all 3 crew members and the layout of their defensive position. They had better cover than the previous machine gun crew, with only brief exposure opportunities when they moved between firing positions. She waited patiently for one of the crew members to expose himself for a clear shot. Military snipers were trained to be patient, to wait hours if necessary for the perfect opportunity. But, in this situation, patience had to be balanced against the urgent need to relieve pressure on the trapped Marines. The opportunity came when the machine gunner shifted position to get a better angle on a Marine squad that was trying to advance to better cover. For approximately 5 seconds, his upper torso was visible through a gap in the rocks. Rodriguez fired immediately. At this extreme range, she couldn't always tell immediately whether her shots were hitting their intended targets. The magnification of her scope was significant, but details were still unclear at 2 kilometers. She had to judge her success by the reactions of other fighters and the cessation of fire from targeted positions. The machine gun position fell silent after her 5th shot, and she could see figures moving frantically behind the rock wall. Whether she had achieved a kill or just forced the crew to seek better cover didn't matter as much as stopping their fire. Every weapon she silenced improved the odds of survival for the Marines below. Rodriguez continued her methodical elimination of enemy positions throughout the afternoon. She targeted mortar crews, machine gun teams, and individual snipers who were picking off Marines from concealed positions. Each shot required careful calculation and patience, but her success rate remained remarkably high for such extreme distances. By late afternoon, she had fired nearly 40 rounds and had achieved what military analysts would later call an unprecedented display of precision marksmanship. The enemy assault on the trapped Marines had stalled completely as fighters sought cover from the mysterious sniper who seemed to strike from impossible distances. But Rodriguez was facing problems of her own. Her water supply was nearly exhausted, and the desert heat was taking its toll on her body and equipment. The barrel of her rifle was becoming hot from repeated firing, which could affect accuracy. Most critically, her ammunition supply was running dangerously low. She had started the mission with 200 rounds, but sustained fire at extreme range meant she was using ammunition much faster than planned. Each shot required careful consideration not just of tactical value, but of resource conservation. Soon she would face the terrible choice of either rationing her remaining ammunition or descending from the ridge to resupply. More troubling still, Rodriguez could see that the enemy forces were beginning to adapt to her presence. They were moving more carefully, using better cover, and coordinating their movements to minimize exposure to long-range fire. Some appeared to be organizing search parties to locate and eliminate her position. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Rodriguez realized that her most dangerous hours lay ahead. Night would bring new challenges and opportunities, but it would also allow enemy forces to move more freely as they attempted to locate and destroy the sniper who had disrupted their entire operation. In the valley below, the Marines had used the respite provided by her intervention to reorganize their defenses and treat their wounded. But they were still trapped, still outnumbered, and still facing an enemy that would likely resume the assault under cover of darkness. Rodriguez prepared for a long night of shooting, knowing that the next phase of the battle would test her skills and endurance in ways she had never experienced before. The impossible shot had become an impossible mission, and the stakes kept getting higher with each passing hour as darkness fell over the Afghan mountains. Rodriguez faced a dilemma that would have challenged even the most experienced military strategists. Her daytime shooting had bought precious time for the trapped Marines, but it had also revealed her general position to enemy forces. Through her scope, she could see small groups of fighters beginning to move along the base of the ridge, apparently searching for routes to reach her elevated position. The night brought both advantages and new dangers. Her scope was equipped with night vision capabilities, giving her a significant advantage in darkness. The enemy fighters below would have more difficulty spotting muzzle flashes from 2 kilometers away, and the cooler temperatures would help preserve both her rifle's accuracy and her own physical condition. But darkness also meant that enemy reinforcements could move more freely. Rodriguez had observed throughout the afternoon that the attacking force was larger and better organized than initial intelligence had suggested. What had appeared to be a few dozen fighters was actually a coordinated group of several hundred, possibly even more. They had been moving additional personnel and equipment into the area under cover of the rocky terrain. Rodriguez's immediate concern was conservation of resources. She had approximately 60 rounds of ammunition remaining, along with less than a quarter of her original water supply. The nearest source of resupply was the trapped Marine unit 2 kilometers away and several hundred meters below her position. Getting to them would require abandoning the tactical advantage of high ground, and there was no guarantee she could return to her current position. She decided to modify her tactics for nighttime operations. Instead of sustained fire against multiple targets, she would focus on precision strikes against the most critical threats. Every shot would need to count, both because of ammunition constraints and because muzzle flashes would be more visible in darkness despite the distance. Through her night vision scope, Rodriguez could see that the enemy forces were indeed preparing for a renewed assault. They were moving equipment and personnel into attack positions, apparently planning to overwhelm the Marine defenses through sheer numbers. Several mortar teams were being repositioned to provide suppressing fire while assault groups advanced on the defensive perimeter. Her first priority was disrupting the mortar teams before they could begin their barrage. Rodriguez identified 3 separate mortar positions that had been established during the afternoon lull. Each was approximately 15 to 1,800 meters from her position, well within the effective range she had already proven during daylight hours. The first mortar team was setting up in a depression between 2 large boulders, apparently believing they were concealed from observation. Through her night vision scope, Rodriguez could clearly see all 4 crew members as they assembled their weapon and prepared ammunition. She selected the team leader, identifiable by his position and the way the others deferred to his directions. Taking aim in darkness required slightly different techniques than daylight shooting. The night vision scope provided adequate target resolution, but depth perception was somewhat reduced. Rodriguez had to rely more heavily on her range estimation skills and her growing familiarity with the terrain. Her first night shot struck the mortar team leader's center mass, and the man collapsed without a sound. The other crew members initially seemed confused, looking around uncertainly in the darkness. When they finally realized what had happened, 2 of them immediately sought cover behind the larger boulder, while the third attempted to continue setting up the mortar. Rodriguez's second shot eliminated the fighter who had tried to continue the mission. The remaining 2 crew members abandoned their equipment and retreated into the rocks, effectively neutralizing the mortar position without requiring additional ammunition expenditure. The second mortar team proved more challenging because they had positioned themselves in a natural cave that provided overhead cover. Rodriguez could only see them when they emerged to adjust their weapon's aim or to retrieve ammunition. She waited patiently for nearly 20 minutes before one of the crew members exposed enough of himself for a clear shot. When the opportunity finally came, Rodriguez fired immediately. The fighter fell backward into the cave, and his teammates dragged him deeper into the shadows. Whether she had achieved a kill or merely wounded the target was unclear, but the mortar position ceased all activity. Sometimes the psychological effect of sniper fire was as valuable as confirmed kills. The third mortar position was the most difficult because the crew had learned from the fate of their comrades. They were using better concealment and exposing themselves only briefly and unpredictably. Rodriguez realized she might need to expend several rounds to neutralize this position, but the tactical importance justified the ammunition cost. She observed the position for 30 minutes, learning the patterns of crew movement and identifying the most predictable exposure opportunities. When she finally engaged, Rodriguez fired 3 quick shots in succession, targeting different crew members as they briefly appeared. At least 2 of the shots found their marks, and the position fell silent. With the immediate mortar threat neutralized, Rodriguez turned her attention to the enemy assault preparations. Through her scope, she could see fighters moving toward attack positions around the marine perimeter. They were using fire and movement tactics, with some groups providing covering fire while others advanced. Rodriguez began engaging individual fighters who appeared to be leaders or specialists. She targeted radio operators, heavy weapon crew members, and anyone who seemed to be directing the movement of other fighters. Her goal was to disrupt enemy command and control rather than simply inflicting casualties. A particularly valuable target presented itself when Rodriguez spotted what appeared to be a senior commander coordinating the assault preparations. The man was moving between different fighting positions, apparently giving final instructions for the attack. He was maintaining good tactical discipline, never staying exposed for more than a few seconds at a time. Rodriguez tracked him through her scope, waiting for the moment when he would be stationary long enough for an accurate shot at extreme range. The opportunity came when he paused to examine a map with 2 subordinates behind a cluster of rocks. The range was nearly 2 kilometers, and the target exposure time would be minimal. She fired during a brief lull in the wind, leading the target slightly to account for his movement. The bullet struck the commander in the upper torso, and he collapsed immediately. The 2 subordinates dragged him behind cover, but Rodriguez could see from their frantic movements that the man was either dead or seriously wounded. The loss of their commander had an immediate effect on enemy coordination. Rodriguez could see confusion spreading among the assault teams as word of the commander's death spread through their ranks. Units that had been moving with purpose began hesitating, apparently waiting for new orders that weren't coming. But Rodriguez also noticed that the enemy was becoming more aggressive in their attempts to locate her position. Several small teams were now climbing different sections of the ridge, trying to triangulate her location based on the sound and flash signatures of her shots. She would soon face the prospect of close-quarters combat with her position compromised. Moving to a new shooting location presented significant challenges. Rodriguez would have to carry all her equipment across difficult terrain in darkness, potentially exposing herself to enemy observation. Any movement would also interrupt her ability to provide overwatch for the trapped Marines below. She decided to establish a secondary firing position approximately 200 meters from her current location, where another cluster of boulders provided concealment and good fields of fire. The move would take her away from the direct threat of the climbing assault teams, while maintaining her ability to engage targets in the valley. Rodriguez carefully planned her movement to minimize exposure and noise. She would have to abandon some of her gear to move quickly, keeping only her rifle, remaining ammunition, and essential survival equipment. The night vision scope and radio would be priorities, but other items would have to be left behind. The movement across the rocky ridge required extreme caution. Any dislodged stone could alert enemy searchers to her presence, and a fall could end her mission as effectively as enemy gunfire. Rodriguez moved slowly and deliberately, testing each foothold before committing her full weight. Halfway to her new position, Rodriguez heard voices below her on the mountainside. One of the enemy search teams was closer than she had realized, perhaps only 50 meters away. She froze against a large rock, hoping that her camouflaged equipment would blend with the natural terrain. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the sound of boots on stone. Rodriguez could make out at least 3 different speakers, communicating in hushed tones as they searched for signs of the sniper. They were moving methodically, checking every possible hiding place with professional thoroughness. A flashlight beam swept across the rocks, just meters from Rodriguez's position. She pressed herself closer to the stone, knowing that any movement would be instantly detected. Her rifle was slung across her back, leaving her secondary weapon as the only immediately available option. At close range, she would have to rely on her sidearm and hand-to-hand combat training. The search team moved past her position without detecting her presence, but Rodriguez knew they would return. Once they established that she wasn't in the immediate area, they would expand their search pattern. Her window of opportunity for reaching the new firing position was closing rapidly. Rodriguez waited until the voices faded into the distance before resuming her movement. She covered the remaining distance to the secondary position as quickly as safety allowed, knowing that every minute of delay increased the chances of detection. The new firing position offered excellent concealment and good sight lines to the valley floor, but the angle was different enough that Rodriguez had to recalculate her shooting solutions. Range estimates, wind compensation, and target lead calculations all had to be adjusted for the new geometry. Through her scope, she could see that the enemy assault was beginning despite the disruption she had caused. Groups of fighters were moving toward the marine perimeter under cover of darkness, apparently hoping to achieve success through surprise and overwhelming numbers. Rodriguez engaged the assault teams as they moved across open ground, targeting leaders and heavy weapon carriers. Each shot was carefully planned to maximize tactical impact while conserving ammunition. She was down to fewer than 40 rounds, and everyone had to contribute directly to marine survival. Her shooting throughout the night continued the remarkable precision she had demonstrated during daylight hours. At ranges that would challenge even the most sophisticated military equipment, Rodriguez was consistently hitting individual targets with a rifle that had been designed for much shorter distances. The psychological effect of her long-range precision was perhaps as important as the tactical results. Enemy fighters became increasingly reluctant to expose themselves, knowing that death could strike from an invisible source at impossible distances. The planned assault fragmented into a series of hesitant, uncoordinated probes that the Marines were able to repel. As dawn approached, Rodriguez had fundamentally altered the tactical situation through her night-long engagement. The enemy force was demoralized, disorganized, and significantly reduced in numbers. More importantly, the trapped Marines had survived the night with minimal additional casualties. But Rodriguez faced a new crisis as the sun began to rise. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted, she was severely dehydrated, and enemy search teams were still hunting for her position. The next phase of the battle would require different tactics, and perhaps even more desperate measures. The impossible shot had become an impossible night, but the most challenging moments still lay ahead as both sides prepared for what might be the final confrontation in this remote Afghan valley. The first light of dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of pink and gold, but Rodriguez felt no appreciation for the natural beauty surrounding her. She had been awake for nearly 24 hours straight, fighting a battle that had pushed her skills and equipment to their absolute limits. Her water was gone, her ammunition down to fewer than 20 rounds, and her body was beginning to show the effects of extreme dehydration and exhaustion. Through her scope, she could see that the situation in the valley had improved marginally during the night. The Marines had used the respite provided by her sniper fire to strengthen their defensive positions and redistribute their remaining ammunition. Several wounded fighters had been moved to better protected positions, and the unit's medics had managed to stabilize the most critical casualties. But Rodriguez also realized that her effectiveness was diminishing rapidly. The enemy forces had adapted to her presence, using better concealment and moving in smaller, more dispersed groups. They had also positioned spotters throughout the area who were specifically watching for muzzle flashes and other signs of sniper activity. Her next shot might well be her last before her position was definitively compromised. Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled over her radio with an update that changed everything. Headquarters had finally managed to organize a relief force, but it wouldn't arrive for another 6 hours. The Marines needed to hold their positions through one more major enemy assault, which intelligence suggested was already being organized. Rodriguez could see the truth of that assessment through her scope. Despite their losses during the night, the enemy forces were regrouping for what appeared to be a final, coordinated attack. They were moving heavy weapons into position and assembling assault teams that would attack the Marine perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. The mathematics of the situation were grim. Rodriguez had perhaps 15 effective rounds remaining, while the enemy force still numbered well over 100 fighters. Even with perfect accuracy, she couldn't eliminate enough targets to prevent the assault from succeeding through sheer numbers. She needed a new strategy, something that would multiply the tactical impact of her remaining ammunition. Rodriguez studied the terrain below, looking for opportunities that conventional thinking might have missed. The valley was a complex landscape of rocky outcroppings, scattered boulders, and steep-sided ravines that could be used to advantage by a creative tactician. Her attention focused on a natural choke point where the valley narrowed significantly. The enemy would have to funnel their assault forces through this area to reach the Marine positions, creating a temporary concentration of targets. More importantly, Rodriguez could see that several large boulders were positioned precariously above the choke point, held in place by smaller rocks that might be dislodged by well-placed rifle fire. The idea was audacious and dangerous. Rodriguez would attempt to create an artificial landslide by shooting out the supporting rocks that held the larger boulders in place. If successful, the rockslide would block the choke point and trap significant numbers of enemy fighters in a kill zone where the Marines could engage them effectively. But the plan required incredible precision under extreme conditions. Rodriguez would need to identify exactly the right rocks to target, calculate the trajectory needed to hit them from her position, and time her shots to coincide with enemy movement through the area. A single miscalculation would waste precious ammunition without achieving any tactical benefit. Rodriguez spent nearly an hour studying the rock formation through her scope, identifying the key stress points that maintained the delicate balance of the larger boulders. She needed to remove 3 specific supporting rocks in the correct sequence to trigger the landslide she envisioned. The first target rock was approximately 1,800 meters away, positioned at the base of a boulder that weighed several tons. The rock was roughly the size of a basketball, but Rodriguez would need to hit it at exactly the right angle to dislodge it without simply chipping off fragments. Through her scope, Rodriguez could see enemy assault teams beginning to move toward their attack positions. The timing of her shots would be critical. She needed to wait until the maximum number of fighters were in the target area, but she also couldn't wait so long that they completed their movement and began the actual assault. Rodriguez chambered around and settled into her shooting position. The angle was difficult, requiring her to fire almost straight down into the valley at an extreme range. Wind conditions were variable, with gusts swirling through the complex terrain in unpredictable patterns. She waited for a lull in the wind and fired her first shot. The bullet struck the target rock with a shower of sparks, and Rodriguez could see fragments breaking away from the impact point. But the rock remained in place, still supporting the massive boulder above it. Her second shot struck slightly lower on the same rock, and this time the damage was more significant. Cracks appeared in the stone, and Rodriguez could see that it was beginning to shift under the weight it was supporting. One more precisely placed shot might be enough to dislodge it completely. The third shot was perfect. The supporting rock shattered completely, and the massive boulder above it shifted and began to roll down the mountainside. The sound echoed off the valley walls as tons of stone thundered toward the choke point below. But Rodriguez's work was far from finished. She needed to target the second supporting rock before enemy fighters realized what was happening and scattered from the impact area. The second target was even more difficult because it was partially concealed behind other rocks. Rodriguez adjusted her aim and fired immediately. The shot struck the edge of the target rock, but failed to dislodge it completely. She could see that the enemy fighters were beginning to react to the landslide, some running toward the impact area, while others sought cover from what they assumed was some form of artillery attack. Her next shot was more successful, striking the target rock at its weakest point and causing it to split in half. The second massive boulder began its descent toward the valley floor, following roughly the same path as the first. The third supporting rock was the most challenging target because it was smaller and positioned at an awkward angle. Rodriguez had to wait for several minutes until enemy movement brought more fighters into the target zone before taking her shot. When she finally fired, the bullet struck the target rock dead center, shattering it instantly. The third boulder began its tumbling descent just as the first two reached the choke point below. The combined impact created exactly the effect Rodriguez had hoped for. The landslide blocked the narrow passage completely, trapping approximately 40 enemy fighters on the Marine side of the obstruction. More importantly, it cut off the main avenue of approach for the planned assault, forcing the enemy to either find alternative routes or abandon their coordinated attack plan. The trapped fighters found themselves in an impossible tactical position. They were cut off from reinforcement and resupply, exposed to fire from the Marine defensive positions, and unable to retreat through the blocked choke point. Some attempted to scale the valley walls to escape, while others sought whatever cover they could find among the scattered rocks. Rodriguez immediately began engaging the trapped fighters with her remaining ammunition. At ranges of 12 to 1,500 meters, her shots were consistently accurate, and each round eliminated a target that posed a direct threat to the Marines below. The Marines quickly recognized the opportunity Rodriguez had created for them. Units that had been pinned down by superior numbers suddenly found themselves facing a much smaller and more manageable enemy force. They began coordinating their fire to systematically eliminate the trapped fighters. Colonel Mitchell's voice came over the radio with obvious relief and admiration. The landslide had completely disrupted the enemy assault plan and provided the Marines with their first tactical advantage since the ambush began. More importantly, it had bought them the time they needed for reinforcements to arrive. But Rodriguez faced a personal crisis that threatened to end her participation in the battle. Her remaining ammunition was down to fewer than 10 rounds. She was severely dehydrated and beginning to show signs of heat stroke, and her rifle barrel was so hot from sustained firing that it was affecting accuracy. More critically, enemy search teams had used the sound and flash signatures from her recent shots to narrow down her position significantly. She could see fighters moving along the ridge, apparently following a systematic search pattern that would eventually lead them to her hiding place. Rodriguez realized that she would soon have to make a choice between abandoning her position to seek safety or remaining in place to provide continued support for the Marines below. Given her depleted ammunition and deteriorating physical condition, leaving might be the tactically sound decision. But, through her scope, she could see that the enemy forces were already adapting to the changed situation. They were organizing new assault routes that would bypass the blocked choke point, and they appeared to have sufficient numbers to mount another coordinated attack. Rodriguez made the decision to remain in position for as long as possible, using her final rounds to maximum tactical advantage. She would target key leaders and specialists, hoping to maintain the disruption of enemy coordination until relief forces arrived. Her next target was an enemy commander who was attempting to reorganize the assault teams for an attack through an alternative route. The man was positioned approximately 1,600 meters away, partially concealed behind a cluster of rocks, but occasionally exposing himself as he moved between different fighting positions. Rodriguez waited patiently for the right moment, knowing that this might be one of her last opportunities to influence the battle. When the commander exposed himself to communicate with a subordinate unit, she fired immediately. The shot was perfect, and the enemy leader collapsed without making a sound. The loss of another key commander had an immediate effect on enemy coordination. Rodriguez could see confusion spreading among the assault teams as they waited for orders that would never come. Units that had been moving with purpose suddenly became hesitant and disorganized. But Rodriguez also noticed that the search teams on the ridge were getting closer to her position. She could hear voices and the sound of equipment only a few hundred meters away. Her time was running out, and she would soon face the prospect of close-quarters combat against multiple opponents. She fired her remaining rounds at targets of opportunity, focusing on enemy fighters who posed the greatest immediate threat to the Marines below. Each shot was carefully planned to maximize tactical impact. But Rodriguez knew that she was fighting a delaying action rather than seeking decisive victory. As her ammunition was finally exhausted, Rodriguez prepared to abandon her position and attempt to reach the Marine perimeter below. The descent would be even more dangerous than the climb up had been, especially in her weakened condition and with enemy forces actively hunting for her. But just as she was preparing to begin her descent, Rodriguez heard a sound that changed everything. In the distance, barely audible above the sounds of battle, was the distinctive whop-whop-whop of approaching helicopters. The relief force was arriving ahead of schedule, and the tactical situation was about to change dramatically. The impossible shot had become an impossible mission, but Rodriguez had accomplished something that military historians would study for decades to come. Through skill, determination, and sheer force of will, she had held off an overwhelming enemy force long enough for help to arrive. The story was far from over, but the tide of battle had finally turned, The sound of approaching helicopters grew steadily louder as Rodriguez pressed herself against the rocky outcropping that had been her home for the past 18 hours. Through her scope, she could see the first aircraft appear over the eastern ridge of the valley, flying low and fast in tactical formation. The relief force had arrived with a vengeance, bringing overwhelming firepower to bear against the enemy forces that had trapped her fellow Marines. The lead helicopter was an Apache attack gunship, its 30mm chain gun already rotating toward target-rich areas along the valley walls. Behind it came a formation of Black Hawks carrying the Marine reinforcement units that would finally break the siege. The distinctive sound of rotor blades echoed off the rocky walls like thunder, announcing that the tactical situation was about to change dramatically. Rodriguez felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her as she watched the aerial cavalry arrive. She had fired every round of ammunition she carried, pushed her equipment and skills to their absolute limits, and held off an enemy force that outnumbered her comrades by more than 3-1. Now help was finally here, and the Marines trapped in the valley below would live to fight another day. But Rodriguez's own situation remained precarious. The enemy search teams were still hunting for her position along the ridge, and she was completely out of ammunition. Her physical condition had deteriorated to the point where she was barely functional, weakened by dehydration, exhaustion, and the stress of sustained combat. Getting down from the ridge alive would require every bit of survival training she had ever received. The Apache gunships made their presence felt immediately, launching Hellfire missiles at enemy strongpoints that had been identified during the night-long battle. Explosions bloomed along the valley walls as carefully prepared fighting positions were systematically destroyed. The enemy forces that had seemed so formidable when attacking trapped Marines suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of overwhelming air power. Through her scope, Rodriguez watched enemy fighters abandoning their positions and fleeing toward any available cover. The coordinated assault that had been building all morning collapsed instantly as fighters scattered to avoid the devastating fire from above. Many threw down their weapons and attempted to surrender, while others simply ran for the limited exits from the valley. The Black Hawks began landing in the secured areas near the Marine perimeter, disgorging fresh troops and much-needed supplies. Rodriguez could see medics rushing to treat wounded Marines, while combat engineers worked to clear landing zones for additional aircraft. The relief operation was proceeding with the precision and overwhelming force that had made the Marine Corps famous throughout its history. But Rodriguez knew that her own rescue was far from certain. She was separated from the main force by nearly 2 kilometers of hostile territory, with enemy search teams still active in the immediate area. Her radio had enough power for communication, but coordinating a rescue would be complicated by the ongoing combat operations throughout the valley. Rodriguez activated her emergency beacon and attempted to contact the relief force commander. Her call sign had been passed through intelligence channels, and she hoped that someone would be monitoring for her signal. After several attempts, she finally made contact with the pilot of one of the Apache gunships. The pilot's voice was professional and reassuring as he confirmed Rodriguez's identity and position. He had been briefed on her situation during the flight to the valley and understood the critical role she had played in keeping the trapped Marines alive. More importantly, he was prepared to provide immediate support for her extraction. But extracting Rodriguez from her position presented significant challenges. The ridge was too narrow and rocky for helicopter landing, and enemy forces were still active in the immediate area. The pilot suggested that Rodriguez attempt to reach a clearing approximately 1 kilometer from her current position, where a Black Hawk could land for pickup. Rodriguez gathered her remaining equipment and prepared for what would be the most dangerous part of her entire mission. She would have to traverse hostile territory while weakened by exhaustion and dehydration, potentially encountering enemy fighters who would be desperate to capture or kill the sniper who had disrupted their entire operation. The descent from her shooting position was treacherous under the best of conditions, but Rodriguez's weakened state made every step a potential disaster. Her hands were bleeding from 18 hours of gripping rough stone, her legs were cramping from dehydration, and her vision was beginning to blur from fatigue. Halfway down the ridge, Rodriguez encountered the enemy search team that had been hunting for her position. 3 fighters appeared suddenly, around a cluster of boulders, apparently as surprised to see her as she was to see them. For a moment, both sides froze as they assessed the unexpected situation. Rodriguez's training took over as she drew her sidearm and engaged the closest fighter before he could bring his rifle to bear. Her shot struck him center mass, and he collapsed immediately. The second fighter managed to fire one wild shot that ricocheted off the rocks beside Rodriguez's head before her return fire eliminated him as well. The third fighter attempted to flee, apparently realizing that he was outmatched despite the numerical advantage his team had started with. Rodriguez tracked him with her pistol but held her fire as he disappeared behind the rocks. She couldn't afford to waste ammunition when she still had unknown distance to cover before reaching the extraction point. The brief firefight had attracted attention from other enemy units in the area. Rodriguez could hear voices and movement among the rocks below her position, indicating that more fighters were moving toward the sound of gunfire. She would have to move quickly to avoid being surrounded by superior numbers. Rodriguez continued her descent, using every available piece of cover to avoid detection by enemy forces. The Apache gunships were providing suppressive fire throughout the valley, but they couldn't engage targets that were too close to Rodriguez's position without risking her safety. The clearing designated as the extraction point was visible in the distance, a small flat area among the rocks where a helicopter could land briefly. But Rodriguez could also see that enemy fighters were moving toward the same area, apparently hoping to intercept her before she could reach safety. Rodriguez used her radio to contact the Apache pilot and request immediate fire support on the approaches to the landing zone. She provided grid coordinates for the enemy positions she could observe, being careful to stay clear of the areas where aircraft ordnance would impact. The gunship's response was immediate and devastating. A series of 30mm cannon bursts walked across the rocky terrain, eliminating the enemy fighters who had been moving to intercept Rodriguez. Secondary explosions indicated that some of the fighters had been carrying grenades or other ordnance that detonated when struck by cannon fire. With the immediate threats neutralized, Rodriguez made her final approach to the extraction point. She could hear the distinctive sound of a Black Hawk helicopter approaching from the valley floor, flying fast and low to minimize exposure to any remaining enemy fire. The helicopter flared into the small clearing with its engines screaming and dust swirling in all directions. The crew chief was already positioned at the side door, scanning for threats while the pilot maintained the aircraft in a hover just above the rocky ground. Rodriguez stumbled toward the aircraft, her strength finally failing as the adrenaline that had sustained her through the night began to fade. The crew chief grabbed her equipment and helped pull her into the cabin as the pilot applied power for immediate departure. As the Black Hawk lifted off and headed toward the main marine positions, Rodriguez finally allowed herself to relax for the first time in nearly 24 hours. Through the cabin windows, she could see the full scope of the battle that had just concluded. The valley that had been a death trap for 540 Marines was now under complete American control. The extraction flight back to the forward operating base took only minutes, but Rodriguez used the time to reflect on what she had accomplished. Military analysts would later calculate that her precision shooting had eliminated or neutralized more than 80 enemy fighters while disrupting the coordination of several hundred more. More importantly, her intervention had prevented what would have been a catastrophic defeat for American forces in Afghanistan. The 540 Marines who had been trapped in the valley were already being hailed as heroes for their stubborn defense against overwhelming odds. But Rodriguez knew that their heroism had been made possible by circumstances that few people would ever fully understand. Upon landing at the base, Rodriguez was immediately taken to the medical facility for treatment of dehydration and exhaustion. As medics worked to stabilize her condition, word of her extraordinary marksmanship was spreading throughout the military command structure. Colonel Mitchell arrived at the medical facility while Rodriguez was still receiving treatment. The grizzled officer, who had seen combat in 3 different wars, told her that her shooting had been the most remarkable display of precision marksmanship he had ever witnessed or heard described. The official after-action reports would document Rodriguez's achievements in technical terms that failed to capture the full drama of her lonely vigil on the mountain ridge. She had engaged targets at ranges that pushed the absolute limits of her equipment, maintained precision under extreme physical and psychological stress, and single-handedly altered the outcome of a major combat engagement. But, for Rodriguez, the most important statistic was the simplest one. Of the 540 Marines who had entered the valley as part of the original mission, 538 were alive when the relief forces arrived. 18 Marines had been wounded, some seriously, but only 2 had made the ultimate sacrifice. In the weeks that followed, Rodriguez's story spread throughout the military community, and eventually reached the highest levels of government. She was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, in recognition of her extraordinary heroism and skill. The citation accompanying her medal told the story in formal military language, but it could never fully convey what it had been like to spend 18 hours alone on a mountain ridge, knowing that the lives of 540 fellow Marines depended entirely on her ability to make impossible shots under impossible conditions. Rodriguez returned to duty after a brief recovery period, but she would carry the memory of that day with her for the rest of her life. She had proven that individual skill and determination could still make a decisive difference in modern warfare, even when facing overwhelming odds. The enemy forces that had planned and executed the ambush had made one critical miscalculation. They had prepared for conventional military responses and had positioned their forces accordingly. But they had not anticipated that a single Marine sniper, armed with nothing but skill, determination, and a rifle, could disrupt their entire operation from a distance that seemed impossible. The valley where 540 Marines had faced death and survived became known in military circles as Rodriguez Ridge, though the modest sergeant would have preferred that it be remembered simply as a place where Marines had done their duty under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Years later, when military historians studied the engagement, they would marvel at the precision and tactical impact of Rodriguez's shooting. But for the 538 Marines who lived to return home to their families, the technical details mattered less than the simple fact that when they needed a hero most desperately, one had emerged from their own ranks to stand watch over them in their darkest hour. The impossible shot had become an impossible story of courage, skill, and determination that would inspire Marines for generations to come. It proved that sometimes, when everything seems lost and the odds are overwhelming, one person with the right skills and the courage to use them can indeed change the course of history. Rodriguez's vigil on the mountain ridge was over, but her legend had just begun.